Hello J300. Today's lecture is called Components of a Page, and what this basically is a quick vocabulary lesson. It's just to make sure that we're all calling the same thing when we're looking at a page. And this is certainly helpful when you jump onto a publication staff and you point to something on a page or on the screen and you call it something. You want to be calling it the thing that most people in the industry call it, and also you want to be able to refer to it in writing. One of the ways that you'll use this in this course is that on the test that you'll take in a couple of weeks here, there will be an essay portion of it, right? And so rather than circling things on the page and describing them with little notes, you're going to be able to write in a paragraph a critique of that page using all of the terms that we're teaching you now. So that's one reason that you should be thinking about it for this course. And then also because when you're looking for feedback from me in this course, I will be referring to things on the page using these particular words as well. So if any of my critique is to make sense, then these words need to make sense too. So we're going to go ahead and look at a couple of different versions of how journalism is generally laid out, and we'll look at some terms that are part of it. So the first thing that we're going to be working with is just basically one of these two spreads, right? The left-hand one is a newspaper page, the right-hand one is a Nicki Minaj on a magazine spread, and we will be just looking at the parts of each one of those pages. So first of all, we're going to deal with the newspaper page, and we're going to look at it from top to bottom. You will see on the links for this page on Blackboard, I've created for you a handout, and this handout allows you to follow along with this lecture and label things on that page. So if you have a printer handy and you can make a print of that page, I think that you'll find that the most useful way to work with this lecture. So at the top of this page, you see it says Wisconsin State Journal, and this is what we call on a newspaper publication the flag or the nameplate. This is the name of the publication, and it generally appears at the very top of the page. So flag or nameplate. The second line here, the thing directly underneath the flag or the nameplate, this is something that we call the folio. Now the folio appears on the front page of a newspaper, but it also appears on almost every page afterwards, where you will see it on the inside pages of newspapers, and as we'll see in a moment here, you also see it when we look at magazine spreads. So the folio tells us all of the information that we need to know about a particular page on a particular publication. One of the reasons that we do this is if someone makes a copy of that page, photocopies it, scans it, emails it, there's kind of proof of where that page came from that's embedded on each one of those pages. So that's called the folio. The next thing on the page here has a sports term to it. It is all of that stuff up there that tells us what else we can expect inside the newspaper. It's called a sports term in that it is called the skybox. It hovers above everything else, much like a skybox does above a stadium, and it holds a bunch of stuff that tells us what's inside. So it is featured content that we would find somewhere else on in the publication, and it's generally featured very high up on the page. Within the skybox, there are other component parts that we will break down in a moment here. One of those is this right here, and it tells us on to the semis. Hope Solo's play in the net propels the U.S. over China in the Women's World Cup. So that is what we would call a teaser or a promo. A teaser or a promo. It tells us something specific that's going to happen inside of the publication. So Skybox, many teasers or promo. One teaser or promo tells us one of the individual things that happens inside of the page, inside the publication, I'm sorry. Next up is this thing right here, and man, oh man, we call this thing a lot of things that are not exactly true journalistically. We call it a title, no. We call it a heading, no. This is a headline, okay? Headline is a summary of the story. maybe 2 or 3 or 4 words, maybe 5, we summarize what the story is about. So in this case, it is a story about gay marriage triumphing as an issue in the United States, and the headline reflects that as well. Underneath that is something that we've dealt with before in a different word. When we talked about this for our infographic, we called this thing an explainer. It's a little bit different when we deal with it in a newspaper term. We call this one of 3 different words here, and newspaper people just can't get on the same page about what to call this. We sometimes call this a deck. Sometimes we call it a subheadline, and then some people will call it a subhead. All of these things are probably okay for you to use in whatever newsroom you're going to be in or whatever publication you'll work at, and most people will understand what you're talking about when you talk about this. This is the second level of detail, for that given story. What happens underneath there? Well, underneath there, we find out what the author's name of this story is, and we find out how to contact that person or maybe what publication they work at. In many publications, it might say Eric Thomas, and then underneath it, it might say the Associated Press, meaning that I don't work for the Wisconsin State Journal, but I work for the wire service, which is the Associated Press. So it tells us where this person works, how they're associated with the publication. In this case here, it tells us the person's email address and their phone number. So if we wanted to contact them as a reader, we could do that. What else do we have on the top half of this newspaper page? We also have this thing over on the side here. This is a graphic representation of the story, and this is what we would call a logo, right? So this is something that the Connect Me Online feature probably happens often for the Wisconsin State Journal, and so this recurring coverage that we would see many, many different times, that recurring coverage has a logo, and that logo is this little speech bubble in this case, and so we lay this thing out to signal to the reader that they can find more of that content, and that is called a logo. Now we're on the bottom half of the page, and on the bottom half of the page, we see that that story is running, and then that story can't finish on the front page. There isn't enough time or space on the front page to accommodate that, and so the story has to do what we call jumping, and this part of the story package is called the jump line. The jump line tells us inside the publication where we can go to read the remainder of that story. So a jump line is a line of text that tells us where the story is jumping to. Above that, we're going to see something that has a couple different names as well. This one is generally called a caption. A caption is a long description of the photo that is above it. Sometimes we call it a cut line. A cut line is generally a very short, maybe phrase or few couple words that describe the photo that is above it. So caption is probably most accurate for this this photo here, but we could also call it a cut line, and most people would understand what we're talking about there. Right above that caption or cut line is the information about who took that photograph, and who took that photograph is called the photo credit, right? Down at the bottom of the page here, we see a lot of words that are sitting underneath this headline and underneath this byline, and those are called the copy or the body copy or the text. Again, this is many different words to describe basically the same thing. Near the middle of our page here, we see this thing that is called the web extra, and we might think that we call this thing a teaser because that teaser up above told us exactly what we would find inside the publication. Well, this is going to go ahead and take us somewhere else. It's going to take us onto the web, and it also has this shaded background behind it. That shaded background is called a screen. The reason it's called a screen is because in the old-timey printing days again, when they didn't want to put 100% of ink on the page, what they would do is they would put literally a screen that the ink would shoot through. If it let through 10% 10% of the ink, then that was called a 10% screen. If it let 50% of the ink through, that was called a 50% screen. So that's why it's called a screen. It creates this this light pattern behind the words that are also printed there. Over on the right-hand side here, we see another one of those screens, but this screen here has a special use. It's telling us you're interested in this story. That's excellent. So let's go ahead and read more about it on the inside of the newspaper. It's not a jump line because it's not continuing that already existing story. It's saying related coverage can be found in there. So if you're looking for related coverage, if you're looking for another story on the same topic, that is called a reefer. Yes, it is called a reefer. A reefer takes us inside the publication to read more stuff about the same kind of topic. Okay. This thing right here, we might just call this thing a line if we didn't have a very strict way of referring to it within journalism. We call this in journalism either a rule or a stroke. A rule is probably the best word for it here. A stroke generally surrounds something, it borders something. So a stroke around a photograph. A rule is probably our best word for this horizontal line that's running across the page here. Down at the bottom, we have a whole bunch of other standing things that happen within the newspaper, whether it's obituaries or sports or television or the Take 5 feature that they have in this publication. What is that thing called? That is called the index. It tells us where we can find all of the standing normal things within the publication. Again, this is not the reefer. It's not telling us related coverage. It's not the teaser. It's not saying go check out this totally unrelated thing. Instead, it's saying these are it's almost like a table of contents in reverse, right? It tells us what's going to happen inside of the publication, but it's at the bottom of the page, so we'll go ahead and call that the index, okay? This huge package of stuff that's happening in the middle of the page gets a specific phrase here, and this is called the centerpiece or the showcase or the lead story, right? All of those things are true. Now we see a lot of things happening here that signal this as being the lead story or the centerpiece or the showcase. First of all, it has 3 different subheads above the headline. It has a large headline. It has large photograph with it. It has 2 different stories. It has a reefer. It has 2 screens. There's so much happening here that it's clear to us that this is going to be the most important story of the day. And so that's why we can call it the centerpiece story with a good deal of certainty here. All right. Now, a lot of you think newspapers, thing of the past. A lot of that terminology is still used in other publications, so we still need to hold on to it. And maybe you want to go ahead and instead work on a magazine. Well, let's learn some magazine terminology that we can go ahead and hold on to. You can see the W on the far left-hand side of the screen here. That's the thing that we're featuring here. What is that thing called when we're designing a magazine spread? We have 2 different words for it. One of them is called a drop cap, and you can see how that W descends into the actual body copy there. That is called a drop cap. Now we can also call that an initial cap. An initial cap is any large letter that starts out a body copy block, but this initial cap also happens to be a drop cap as well. So it does both of those things. So the W, drop cap, the W, also an initial cap, 2 different words for a similar thing. Over on the right-hand side of this page here, we have a bunch of words that were pulled from this Nicki Minaj interview. I really toned down the sexual stuff. There was no need for me to do it, she said. That is called a pull quote. It is a quotation that has been pulled from the rest of the story and highlighted, literally highlighted in pink in this case. Oftentimes this will be repeated content from the story, or sometimes you might go ahead and take a quotation that didn't fit in the rest of the story and go ahead and put it in pull quote so that the reader gets some new information that they can't otherwise get. This entire package of stuff, the headline, the words, the drop cap, the pull quote, everything that we have here. These two facing pages are called a spread. Okay. There are many different kinds of spreads inside of a magazine. One of them is called a natural spread. The natural spread is that magic spread right in the middle of a publication where the actual same piece of paper is going to make up the left-hand page and the right-hand page. It's called a natural spread because that piece of paper is actual continuous all the way through that spread. Spread is just two facing pages. What about the bottom of this? This tells us what the publication name is, what page we are on. We've used this term before, so you might already have this one on the tip of your tongue. This one is the folio, right? It tells us, again, what the publication name is and what date it was published and what page we're on in that publication as well. Now we're up above one of these blocks of copy that's right in the middle of the story. We've used this word before to refer to something different. This is also a subhead. So subheads can happen right below the headline. We can see that there's a subhead right below those really large sans serif, heavyweight pink words that say Nicki Minaj right below there. That's one example of a subhead, but subheads can also be used to break up the text of a story, and that's what they're being used for here, right? We also want to talk about stuff that actually isn't anything at all. And what are those things? So what is this space here? It's the space between the two facing pages. It's not actually, circling anything of consequence here, but that is called the gutter. Now the gutter is also going to be used in another term that we'll talk about in a moment here, but the two facing pages in between them is called the gutter. That term certainly makes sense in terms of physically what it looks like on our page. The other thing that we see here is that there's space in between these columns here, in between a column of text and the next column of text. That's also called a gutter. So all of the space in between those columns of text and the space in between facing pages, all of those are called the gutter. Around the outside of the page here, we have a lot of space that isn't being used there. What is that space called? Well, it's certainly, we would call it a margin. Let's learn this term as being the external margin, meaning the amount of space that happens from the outside of our content to the outside of the page. What is that stuff called? It's called the external margin. Then what are all of these things called, right? These are space that is not to the outside of the page, but to the inside of the page. We can see along Nicki Minaj's left elbow there that there is a bunch of space between that and the text. We see some space in between the headline and the subhead, in between the byline and the subhead. All of that is called internal margin, right? And we generally want to keep those internal margins relatively consistent. Now look at what the designer did here though. Notice how there is more space between the headline and subhead than there is between the subhead and the byline. Why did they do that? They did that intentionally to give the headline even more significance, to go ahead and pull that subhead and that byline together as more of a package. So that amount of space was intentionally done that way to represent that, right? So that's the internal margin. That's it. That's all there are for components of a page. I do want to point out this one thing. What a great little set of flashcards I've created for you. If you go and visit the Blackboard page and look at the lecture, just the slides for this lecture, you can go ahead and flip all the way through them and use the circled content and ask yourself, what is it? What's the definition of it? And then just keep going through it. It's almost like a set of flashcards, really good at helping you learn these terms so that you can use them for the exam and also down the road as well. That's it for this lecture. I've got another one that I'll post in just a moment here. Hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you again soon.